Hello. So last time I was talking a little bit about the mindfulness of feeling, and at the end of it, it gets into this place where it talks about the gratification and the danger in feeling. The gratification being like what we enjoy in it, but the danger that happens there. For instance, like if the feeling changes, and then the Buddha says, when it becomes otherwise, the person who has skill, their mind, like the noble disciple's mind, does not follow and turn. Like, so when the feeling turns kind of like unpleasant, their mind, they don't have to follow and turn and go with it, right? And so that expression does not follow and turn reminded me a lot of when we were studying Nagarjuna and they talked about those line of cows, that one would follow another, kind of like the feeling goes negative, so now I have to go negative. So that's kind of like what happens when we don't have wisdom or insight. We're just kind of blindly dragged along by feeling. But in that sutra, they were actually talking about, they did that for each of the 5 aggregates. So I really wanted to kind of focus on that. I want to focus on this a little bit in my retreat this winter. And but I found it a little inaccessible in a certain way until I found this one verse that kind of, or one teaching that opened it up for me, where a person was talking about how through ignorance we experience the aggregates as the self. They embody who we are, what we are, this notion of I am. But the way they broke it down for someone who is just an ordinary being like myself, I found very helpful, a good starting point. And they said, form, the material body, is where I am. And feelings are how I am. And discriminations are what I am, like what I am perceiving. And volitions are conditioning factors, but here the volitions works quite well, is why I am acting, for instance. And then the consciousness then puts it all together and says, whereby I am experiencing. And so I've kind of been playing around with that. And then I got kind of stuck in certain places on this. There's different words that people use and this and that. So I thought I would just talk a little bit about the 5 aggregates in general, because I wanted to get more familiar for my own mind. And they are, one way you can think about them is they're categorizing all the impermanent phenomena. But another way, they talk about them as a relationship to a person. So then, in that case, they're the basis of designation of a person. So in one way, you can say the 5 aggregates are the body and mind. But if you break them into the 5, and speaking primarily of a person, form is, in one way, you could say form narrowly is just shape and color. But in this, when we're talking about the 5 aggregates, it's actually including all the physical constituents, essentially your body. Feeling, then, sometimes they use the word sensation, all the physical and mental sensations that accompany all the moments of consciousness. So they're an omnipresent mental factor. We always have this present. Our experience of pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral, or what they actually say is neither pleasant nor unpleasant, is how you read it in the sutras. So that's what feeling is about, and I've talked about that a lot because that's the practice I had worked on a lot. And then discrimination has many translations, and really that's a very good translation. It also is one of the omnipresent mental factors. And in that sense, the way Venerable Chodron explains it, I think, is clearest. It apprehends the distinctive characteristics of an object, so it can distinguish one thing from another. And in that sense, this allows us to perceive an object in a way so that when it's perceived again, you can readily categorize it and recognize it and categorize it conceptually. So it relates to that process. And in this perceptual context, there's 6 ways that we do this. We have 6 kinds of discrimination. One that discriminates visual objects, objects that we smell, objects that we hear, mental objects, all that. And so this is the way it's used when they talk about the 5 aggregates. So one way, one person described it as it's a factor that discriminates or perceives pleasant and unpleasant sensations as being such. That's the thing I find hard when I haven't spent much time with this, but it's kind of like a connector as I see it, because what happens then is then it gives rise to afflictions. So you've gone from the feeling to the unpleasant, pleasant, and neutral. Now you're going into aversion, attraction or attachment. And then those afflictions are going to motivate actions. So it's kind of like what's happening during that discrimination is something that I think will be interesting in a retreat time to try to discern. And then the fourth of the 5 is what Venerable is now translating as miscellaneous factors. And some other translations are compositional factors, volitional factors, conditioning factors, mental formations, mental activity. So these are, one way to think about these is in terms of as mental factors, things like the feeling, discrimination, the ones other than that, because we've already separated those out. So this is like, remember the fourth one here is the grab bag that takes all the other impermanent phenomena that aren't in the other 4, right? The body is impermanent, the feelings are impermanent, discriminations are impermanent, consciousness is impermanent, everything else, boom, they throw it in this 4th category. So it's kind of the grab bag. So so that's where the mental factors are, except for feeling and discrimination, which have been separated out. So that's things like our emotions and our attitudes and our views. And then also it includes the abstract composites such as karmic seeds, latencies of afflictions. And one way this was described that I found kind of helpful was it talked about these as, when you think about it as conditioning factors, especially in this context that we're speaking of, that's kind of nice, because then you can see how the mental factors are conditioning factors, and how even other things like that are unrelated to thought that are in this category, like time and duration and the life faculty, these are also conditioning factors. So that's what that 4th one is. And then the 5th one is consciousness, which is primarily our primary consciousnesses, like eye consciousness, auditory consciousness, tactile consciousness, things like that. So then if we go back to what he was saying, it's interesting to then think how we would look at an experience, like say you've suffered some loss, and all these things are coming up in your mind, or maybe you're suffering some other kind of disturbing situation. Then you can kind of like, well, here I am, I'm located here, my body is here, my feeling, probably in those situations, unpleasant. My discrimination, this is that, what is that doing? It's seeing things in a certain way. That's the thing that I find kind of interesting, like, because the feeling doesn't have anything but a feeling, pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, right? So what is it that makes that such an uncomfortable experience? It's not that alone, I don't think. I think a lot happens with this discrimination, like what I am, and then what it brings from that, why I am, like the different angers and afflictions that come up, the mental factors, right? We're in that 4th one. And then the consciousness, whereby I am experiencing this, right? So the Buddha said this a little more poetically, I think, when he talked about these similes, which I think is a nice way to end this. And it's nice to think about these things when you're experiencing something that you're trying to kind of decipher and learn about and see what's going on in your mind. Think of this, our material form, he compares to like a lump of foam that's carried away by a river. A lump of foam isn't exactly beautiful. The aggregates aren't exactly beautiful. And it's just insubstantial as well. And then the feelings are like impermanent bubbles that form when rain drops, and they just come, go, come, go, come, go. And then discrimination is kind of like a mirage. the illusory nature of things, but thinking of it like a mirage is like, we think something's there that isn't, like we think we're seeing a jerk. Or, I'm not sure. I don't know much about discrimination, but that's what it makes me think about. Like, we can add a lot to these things. And then the reason that is when you think about it, when karma is ripening in the feeling component, and after feeling, so there's contact and then feeling, it's after feeling between what comes next where you have a chance to cut into this. So you could discriminate maybe something else. You could maybe habituate yourself to something else. Like, I don't think in the moment, but as you tear things apart, you can retrain the mind to habituate yourself. So, you could look at this unpleasant thing feeling in a very different way. You don't have to add all the extra baggage on it. And then so anyway, like a mirage, there's not really water there. It's not maybe really what you're thinking it is. And then volitions, that's a good way to translate it here. They call that like a plantain tree because there's no heartwood. It's like there's no essence to them. Like if you really try to find one of these mental factors, like where is the anger? You just kind of dissect it out. You'll just come down to these moments of mind that are similar and not something really substantial there that you can grab onto so easily. And then consciousness, they compare to the deceptive performance of a magician. So we've now put the whole thing together, and here we go, creating our magical illusions. And these are the reason why, I think the Buddha described these things, like each one of these 5, he talked about the arising, the cessation, the gratification, the danger, and the escape from each of these in that previous sutra. And so I think that, as we're moving into retreat and we have more opportunity to slow down and see things more as they arise, this is one way that we could discern things to help ourselves to have the escape, the freedom essentially, not like being those cows that are just following each other one after another and falling off the cliff. We does not follow and turn. We don't have to follow and turn the feelings that come up. The feelings will come up. You can't really stop between contact and feeling. There's not a place for us to cut that. But so they do come up. Then what? Do you follow and turn? You don't have to.